Right, hi everyone, welcome back to another term. Right, I hope that it's been a good June holidays and I hope your mid years have gone well as well. Right, but it's time to restart, it's time to get a new start for this term. Right, and it's going to be a very quick, very fast paced term. Okay, so in terms of content for this lecture series for term 3, okay, we're going to be focusing on the concepts of society and inequality. Now you realize that the content here has been uh, slow in terms of its progression, and the reason for that is that we believe that these topics that are covered under these large, big ideas are more important for your understanding in the modern world. Okay, and today we're gonna be, switching gears a bit, right? The last term we've been talking about youth, we've been talking about family unit, right? So the foundations of society. In unit 2, we are going to basically go into the idea of exposing the deep dark secrets and issues with society, and one of those main idea is under the category of inequality, right? So in this topic, we'll look at things like gender inequality, which is our first idea here. We'll look at poverty, and we will end off with education as a measure of inequality and as a driver of equity, right? So yeah, that is basically the idea for this particular term. Right, so let's get started. All right, today's lecture is going to be very, very short. It's just giving you a little bit of a introduction into uh, inequality and also gender inequality, which is the first focus for this term. I don't want to overwhelm you so early on, right after your mid-years. All right, so we're gonna start it slow. Okay, so we're gonna talk about the road to gender equality, and the overarching statement here is whether gender equality is achievable in a deeply divided world. Okay, so first and foremost, you need to understand. Actually, before we even talk about gender, let's talk about what inequality is. Right, so I'm sure you all have heard some iteration of the word inequality, or even in fact equality, right? And the idea is that equality is the true equal. So any of you that study math before, I mean all of you have studied math before, will know that if something is equal to something, that means that they are equivalent. Okay, so means exactly the same. Now, obviously in this world there is almost impossible, at least for societal construct, to bring about true equality, which means two people being having exactly the same attributes, exactly the same strengths, exactly the same opportunities. It is almost impossible in society. Okay, and mainly because society is not naturally occurring, right? So even in the natural world, you can see that equality truly does not exist, and which is why you probably heard more recently the term equity. Equity. Okay, equity actually is used to represent the idea that it's not just about having two equivalent things. It is the idea of being fair, right? So establishing fairness, fair opportunities for all, fair treatment for all. That is what equity is. So actually, when we're talking about gender equality, we are actually talking more about the idea of gender equity, which is the idea that men, women, and otherwise everybody having the same opportunities, the same treatment, and the same level of success, or rather, same approach to success. Okay. Okay. So now we can go back into what gender is. Now, what you need to differentiate in this topic, at least for the discussion of sociology, is in fact gender is not a biological term, as many of you would have come to know it as. Okay, gender is in fact a societal term. Okay, it is something that is a construct that is created as part of society. Now, the word sex, right, is a biological term. All right, it refers to the essentially male or female, okay, masculine or feminine, and essentially that will be the defining biological term when it comes to, calling you a guy or a girl or otherwise, right? So gender, we are talking about it as a societal construct, okay, something that is coming out of socially learned expectations and behaviors, right? So it's not so much about whether you're born male or female, all right? It is more about what being born male or female encompasses for your life. That is the idea of gender. Okay, so it is almost impossible to come with the topic of gender equity without talking about the diminished role of women. All right, so it is a very, very, very well known fact that women's rights have not been entrenched in many societies, historically speaking, right? And it's only up to very, very recently, actually, if you consider the true span of human society, that women's rights have actually been emphasized. And living in the 21st century, this is honestly, right, looking at the historical position of women, the current position of women is already the best uh, out of all the hundreds of thousands of years that the humans have been around, right? But of course, there's a lot more to be desired as well, right? So, generally speaking, if we're talking about why women's rights are not entrenched, it is simply because there is a perception. And remember, it is perception, doesn't mean it is true. It's not fact. It is just a perception that women are seen as submissive and subservient, okay, to men, obviously, right? But obviously, now as things progress, we realize that this particular categorization is, of course, inherently and utterly flawed. But we have to realize why, right? So the study of cause, okay, is very important here. Okay, if you want to solve an issue, the first thing you look at is the cause, right? So gender roles, I'm sure all of you have heard of this term before. Gender roles, they come with different cultures, they come with different traditions, but some long-standing things like the man going out to work or the woman cooking, cleaning, rearing the child has been long-standing in, dare I say, almost every single society in the world, right? And this is what some people call the patriarchal system. Patriarchy is, in fact, the system where it is essentially male dominated or male focused, right? So, yeah, so that is patriarchy. But if you ever wonder why this is the case, you actually go back and look at the idea of sexual division of labor. Okay, so this was a practice in which societies divided the task, okay, that needs to be achieved by that particular family or that group of people between male and female, right? So it was established a very long time before that males having a larger physique and stronger body, right, biologically speaking, right, they can go out to work. And remember, in those days, going out to work usually encompass a lot of physical activity. It encompass a lot of danger as well, right? So that was given to the man. While the woman who is seen, again perceived as being sensitive and emotional and more caring in general, right, is expected to do all the more minute tasks. Minute as in not less important, but minute as in more domestic in nature, right? So that encompasses the cooking, cleaning, and child rearing, obviously, as it comes to be in society. And this is a concept that has been, rather, the division concept has been posited in every single society in human history up to this day, right? So you have heard of all these dichotomies, right? Dichotomies are essentially, um, how do I phrase it? Dichotomies are essentially a division between two things that are seen as opposites, right? So you can see the opposites here: practical versus undecided, independent versus dependent, right? So that is obviously a lot more male centric. Whereas the idea that childish versus mature or brute versus gentle is a lot more women-centric. So you can see dichotomies negatively affect everybody that is involved, right? So no matter which dichotomy you choose, it is still a perpetuation of this particular inequality, right? So these are just additional gender stereotypes between the feminine, masculine, yeah, in society. And the interesting thing to note, you realize in many languages, right, there is gender. So does English. English has feminine terms, masculine terms, but it also has neuter terms, okay, which are basically terms where have no sex at all. Okay, so why does gender matter then? Right? If it's just a societal construct, if it's just a concept, then why does it matter? Right? And this comes down to what we call the gender socialization theory. You can memorize this, you cannot memorize this. It's up to you. But you need to understand this idea. The idea is that every society has expectations associated with the biological sex. Okay, doesn't matter whether these expectations are founded or not founded, right? They exist, and that simply enough is enough to shape the importance of gender in society, right? So even though today we have launched a lot of challenges against these traditional expectations, particularly, but you will realize that a lot of people unconsciously fall into these roles. And we'll look at this more in detail when we talk about the causes of gender equality. But the issue lies in how deep this inequality is in our society. Okay, so we'll look at that in the coming lectures. And of course, today we are not just prescribing gender identity based on biological sex anymore, right? Gender identity is seen as something that is very personal, very that defines somebody's life in general. Okay, and this is why people today have been advocating for the personal choice in gender identity as opposed to the societally appointed identity of the past, right? And this can be mostly seen in the use of pronouns, right? Be it he, she, or they, right? These are all pronouns that people choose in order to make themselves feel most comfortable and feel most relatable, right? And that is something that we might explore a little bit more when it comes to the deepening of the issue. If gender equality was not difficult enough, this in itself adds a more additional layer of complexity to the issue that we'll discuss further, of course. Right, so manifestations, right? The most common manifestation is women are paid less than men. This is a common fact that everybody knows, right? So why? All right, there are many different theories. Okay, I've chosen two here, okay, to discuss or rather to introduce. One is the human capital theory, which basically posits that why women are paid less than men is in fact due to the discrepancy in terms of the characteristics that women bring to the job. What do I mean by that? Right? So it is perceived, all right, that women bring, the idea of marital status, they bring the idea of children, and they bring the idea of domesticity, right, to the job. And even though we realize that doesn't necessarily affect a woman's ability to do something, it is enough to perpetuate that discrimination, right? Just because women naturally have these few things associated with them, this is enough to divide the wage between men and women, right? A lot of people, especially in deeply patriarchal societies, see women as having additional burdens than men, and therefore the work that they bring, or the efficiency and the efficacy of the work that they bring, is much more diminished than men. And that is what human capital theory means. Capital as in the resource, right? The dual labor market theory, it posits something a little bit different. It is the idea that men and women have different positions in the labor market. So they work in very different labor market segments. Okay, so it is believed, all right, that women take greater emphasis on considerations rather than men who are more focused on money, right? So one focuses more on the intangible, one focuses more on the tangible, right? And uh, essentially that shows that it is one step more difficult for women to get the same recognition and to get the same perception of doing so-called a good job as compared to men because of these considerations. Now, this is not to say that these perceptions are good. This is not to say these perceptions are accurate, right? This is simply a perception, and in fact the perception alone is enough to trump facts, and that is seen in almost every societal instance in history, right? So these are just two possible theories, okay, as to why these wage gap exists, right? So as you can see, the wage gap across the world is still very high. There is no country in the world where women are paid equal to men. Okay, there is no nation in the world currently in June of 2023 that pays women the same amount as men. Right? And the worst offenders are South Korea and Japan, which will look in details as case studies of deeply modern patriarchal societies, right? And we're not talking about, less developed countries as we did in the last chapter. We are looking at first world developed economies, but yet still have the problem of gender equality. And in fact, they are the worst offenders of gender equality among the developed nations of the world. And we'll look at why and perhaps what problems that has caused, right? I just read an article. If you saw my Instagram story, Japan sent a G7, it sent a man to the G7 summit on women empowerment. I think women, something to do with women's rights. And in fact, the G7 is hosted by Japan this year. So it is a man presiding over many women from the G7 nations on a topic about women's rights, which is deeply baffling to me. But again, we'll take a look at this issue in further detail, right? But nevertheless, this shows you that maybe it's not about develop or not develop. Maybe there's something deeper to it. In Singapore, this is still a problem, right? In 2020, full-time female employees earned 14.4% lower, even though it was a narrowing from earlier, but it still exists nonetheless. All right? And so we'll look at the factors and we'll look at possible solutions that have been suggested to narrow this gap, not just in terms of economically, but also socially. And so I leave you off with this very apt, description or rather depiction of inequality, right? One being much more easier to achieve than the other, right? So can we make a change? Some people believe, if social inequality exists, then we cannot necessarily claim that gender inequality cannot exist, i.e., it will continue, right? And simply because people treat each other differently, gender inequality can never be ruled out as a possibility. So that's the orange words there. People are treated differently even in distinct groups, so why should we expect otherwise between genders? And yet, ultimately, what does it take for a person to be a good man, a good woman, or even just a decent human being in today's modern society? And possibly the answer to this question can solve the problems of gender inequality in today's society. Okay, and as such, we will expand more on individual ideas in this topic in the coming weeks. All right, and it will be something that is going to be very interesting and also very rewarding, I hope, for not just your GP journey, but your understanding of the world at large. Right? So keep reading and prepare for this very, very hectic term ahead. Right? So I wish you all the best in term three, and I will see you back very, very soon for the next lecture. Right? So all the best. Have a good weekend, everyone, and I'll see you soon.